Thank you everyone for joining me on another episode of Sitting Down with Scholars, where I'm joined by Mark, a PhD candidate. And Mark, could you start off by telling myself and my guests a little bit more about your research so far?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jordan. I guess my research is, I'm a PhD candidate in criminology, first of all, and so my research is particularly concerned with how young people charged with offences give input into the criminal legal system. And so that research has involved a period of fieldwork in Victoria, Australia, where I come from, if you can tell by the way I sound. And yeah, I sort of did a sort of interview-based project there, looking at the different ways that young people and their lawyers kind of work together to give that input into the legal process. And where I'm at in my PhD right now is kind of starting to analyze the data that I collected.
Okay, so before going into your research and the data side of it, so what pulled you or drew you to come to study at Cambridge or to study a particular program that you're on?
Yeah, so I guess maybe I can talk about the research topic itself first, because I don't think people are always surprised when I talk about having studied criminology kind of all the way through undergrad and stuff. Like, I don't have a background in law or anything. Like, pretty much the only thing I've ever studied is criminology. It took me a while to kind of commit to that as a major. So in undergrad, I kind of dabbled in a couple of things, but ended up with a criminology major. And it was around the time when I was it was towards the end of my undergrad when I sort of realized, like, criminology is actually this really cool discipline. Like, not because it's, about, catching criminals or like becoming police officers or anything like that, but it's kind of this discipline that has this language around talking about injustice in a very particular way. And I wanted to learn more about how to use and how to, sit with this language. And so that was what kind of drew me into criminology a lot. And then at the same time, I was kind of working in the youth sector back in Australia with just young people in general. But every time we kind of would work with young people in the justice system, like, the language that we would use to kind of talk about those young people would be very, very different, right? And so like, my current topic is kind of a way to bring those interests together, I think, in terms of thinking about how young people in contact with the justice system are represented.
I was going to say, I know a lot of people, when they think about criminology, and I potentially, from my own naivety, originally would have, very similar to what most people view criminology, law and order, police force, preparing you for that very potential career jump into studying, into being a police officer. That would have been, and I'm sure most people, because they associate criminology with crime, rather than what, from watching various videos that I've seen you put out, is more around the social sides of law, order, justice, and the other sides of society as a whole, and how different people are affected by various elements of the law and within the law. Hopefully that's a good summary of what you would hope someone takes from it.
Yeah, that's a great summary. I think criminology, really, I think, like, the fundamental kind of philosophical thing behind criminology is that there is this thing that we call crime, right? And there's this category of activities that we attribute that label to. And I think, the study of crime can't be this neutral thing. You're not just studying this category because it exists as a thing, right? The category only exists because we've called it that. And so the study of criminology is really about unpacking. Well, to me, it's really about unpacking what kind of goes into, or what work goes into the creation of that category of crime. But yeah, it isn't like that for, like, everyone in criminology. Like, as you said, there are people who come to the field and there are people who stay in the field because they're drawn to police work. But there are also a lot of people in the field who are quite critical of police work, right? Because the police are, in a lot of ways, a very violent institution. Which we can get into. We can get into that, but it'll depend on how much time we have. Right? Yeah, I could
appreciate that. And one of the things I'm particularly fascinated by, having only ever been to Australia as a tourist, and one of the areas that really interests me is how crime and justice and law and order, so to speak, and the various parts that go into the social fabric of societies works differently when you have an Indigenous community who have and the non-Indigenous community. I know, speaking from someone who's lived in Britain all my life, and the country is very much responsible for most, if not all, the fabrics of colonialism and imperialism, especially in a modern sense.
Yeah, it is. It is very, very different because obviously, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia is like in the criminal justice system is a huge part of the reality of living in a place like Australia, right? And it's a huge part of learning criminology. Like you can't learn criminology, settler colony like that without kind of grappling with that sort of massive inequity that's there and staring at you plainly in the face. But I think it's interesting because I don't know. I think the settler colonialism side is like it introduces a very specific kind of social dynamic where, obviously like people come and then they kind of supplant the local indigenous communities, obviously. And then kind of, if you read, Patrick Wolf's work, it's kind of about like, sort of eliminating them and then hiding them out of sight, which, is what the justice system and ultimately prisons kind of do. But like, I think those dynamics kind of are embedded in a lot of criminal justice systems, right? Like even in the UK, like, prisons are a very kind of out of sight, out of mind way of dealing with people that you don't want to accept as part of your community. Yeah, it's just obviously the extra layer is, when those people were there first. But, even in a place like the UK, right, like prisons are kind of, they function in this exclusionary way as well, or they can.
Yeah, and I think equally, I would have presumed that a lot of people, yourself included, they grapple in society with the whole. You have the side of people who are very much on a rehabilitation front, and that is the purpose of the criminal justice system. And then you have others who are very much on the side of it's punishment, and looking purely from the case of the crime and how you deal with that, what has happened in that individual case, rather than what is the root cause of the crime, and equally how do we rehabilitate the individuals who've committed said crime. And I'd imagine that in itself is both challenging and fascinating topic to pursue, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so. It's very, obviously like a politically contentious topic, right? And I think as you said, a lot of those elements of the criminal justice system, those two kind of purposes, to punish and to rehabilitate, are kind of tied together in ways that are really hard to pull apart. And then, then we get into the whole conversation about like whether or not it's possible to reform kind of criminal justice institutions so that we can pull apart these elements of punishment and rehabilitation, or whether we need to kind of start from scratch again. And there are, a lot of abolitionist criminologists out there who believe we should start from scratch because there's sort of nothing redeemable about, the prison and police as institutions. Again, this is we could be here for a while, but something I'm very passionate about anyway.
Yeah, I can completely understand that. And I know there was one, admittedly, I can't remember the paper, but it was about a case in of more of a, I would say, tribal system where rather than having a case of basically, rather than punishing the individual, so to speak, it was more of a community cohesion approach, and that was a different approach. I would love to know I'd love to remember what the paper was, but I think it was one of those, articles that you read in passing and go, oh, that was interesting, and forget to put it to use a tarot and all that.
Yeah, it happens all the time. But yeah, like that idea of, what you're describing sounds like, a sort of more forgiving in a lot of senses of that word, a more forgiving kind of institution or a more forgiving way of doing justice, which I think is really important, right? And it's an easy thing to lose because in a smaller, more tight-knit community, you kind of can't avoid the fact that these people are going to come back into the community, right? So you kind of have to find a way of forgiving them, or you have to find a way of reintegrating them. Whereas I think in the world that we live in, it's very easy to hide the people that you don't want to associate with and just kind of be in your own little bubble, and you kind of can live in this world where you don't have to, and you don't want to have to think about, them, right? Those people.
As a thought then, so what brought you from Australia to the UK?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that has less to do with criminology, more just to do with what I was doing in life. So after I did my undergrad and I did my honours, which is like a master's equivalent in Australia, I worked for about a year and a little bit over a year, sort of full-time. So I'll start. Just new sentence. I'll start the sentence again. So I left academia for a little while to go into work. And then I always kind of knew that I wanted to do the PhD at some point, but I sort of, started getting quite distracted by the work environment as well. It was a really good, I liked my job. I liked my coworkers. some of whom watch my videos. So I feel like I have to say that. No, I did genuinely like the work that I was doing, but it was also kind of like, it was work that I could see myself doing for the rest of my life, which was kind of scary as a 20-something-year-old to kind of feel like the rest of your life is kind of written out in this way. And knowing that the PhD was always something I wanted to do, I was like, let me just sort of rip the band-aid off cold turkey, go somewhere else and do it. And like, admittedly, moving to the UK and going to Cambridge is kind of cool. Like, it's, there's a big criminology department here. I won't say that it's it's always a very like intellectually pure environment in the same way that criminology in certain places in Australia anyway are kind of very focused on that kind of social justice oriented, anti-police kind of schools of thinking. But it's a place that's allowed me to kind of separate myself from a lot of distractions in Australia where I grew up and worked and all of that, and so just sort of really commit mentally fully to the PhD project. So, yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And so I suppose the next few questions are more around about your personal academic journey. So part of this you've just really taken me through with your degrees, but what drove you to pursue the particular path? So more criminology in general. What was the eureka moment, for lack of a better term, that pushed you in this direction?
I remember there being one essay that I wrote towards the end of my undergrad about it was about a very specific thing. It was looking at how privatization and private companies kind of led to certain conditions in Australian immigration detention that led to a number of deaths by suicide. And it was in the process of writing this that I kind of realized that thing I was saying before of like criminology having this language to understand injustice, right? Because it's, what happened, it's unjust. I think it's, unjust. It's awful anytime anybody like dies from anything, but in this particular case, there were so many kind of forces that played into it that was just really fascinating for me to kind of, I don't know if it's insensitive for me to find writing about like death a fascinating thing. That's probably not the right word to use, but it was using that language to kind of think through why would something like this happen, right? In this, in a society where we don't have the death penalty, in a society where people shouldn't die at the hands of the state, why would something like this happen? And I think in the process of writing that, it kind of helped me come to this realization that criminology as a discipline is something that can be interested in a topic like this and has the language to kind of analyze and unpack something like this. And I know that's not exactly what I'm studying now, so part of me is also like, does this actually answer the question? But I think more broadly, the language around talking about injustice and making sense of injustice in the world is something that I was just, very, very drawn to. And this essay was a very specific example of how that language might be used that I kind of continue to use in my work today.
And I will say it also highlights for, I think, a lot of people that point around, even today, the corporate criminal justice side and the public criminal justice side. A lot of corporations can do wrong and get away with it, or with, I would say, very tokenistic gestures get away with it. I mean, I think the best example that always comes to my mind is the financial crisis, where I think only one person, and it was very much to even someone who doesn't study criminology, the fact that only one person was sentenced remotely, it was the fact that in itself, whether sentencing is right or wrong is a different kettle of fish for that, but the fact that only one person out of all of the financial sector was sentenced because of that should have been a question, and it is often the case, I personally think, of crime where it's overlooked, corporate crime specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually that was the unit that I wrote that essay in, and that was a unit that I went back to teach a little bit later because I taught as well while I was working. And it's always been like, it was the subject that made it click for me, just this sort of full subject dedicated to corporate and white collar crime. Definitely one of the areas that's really, really overlooked. And we kind of, just the relationship that we have with corporations is really interesting. Things happen in the world. Corporations kind of come in and out of favor, but they're always there. And what do we do about that? I don't know. Yeah.
No, and I will say, I think, I'm not sure from Australia how Australia manages its utilities, but like in the UK, I know contentious area at the moment, as I'm sure you've seen. There's a lot around like water, where we have a number of different corporate actors who are effectively polluting the rivers, whether that's through underinvestment or for whatever reason. But the argument of that is there's no way of really holding them to account, because you find the company puts the burden onto the taxpayer, and then does it really ever hold anyone to account with the punitive schemes that we've got? And yeah, that's just an observation of an example, and I'm sure that one that many people in the UK specifically, and potentially elsewhere, will have experienced or thought of.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting example as well. And that's something that, there are branches of criminology that deal with this exact question, right? When it's like such a large scale kind of an environmental related thing, it's like, how do you hold someone accountable for that? At the same time as like, if people kind of start taking to the streets in protest, for example, against this, because what other avenues do they have? Then it's kind of often those people that get criminalized. So it's like, how do you make sense of this sort of almost double injustice, right? That there's something wrong, that there's nothing that we can do about the something that's wrong. But then when people do the only thing that they have left as an option to do about the thing that's wrong, they're the ones doing something wrong. That's not the most articulate way, but it's, it's the kind of double-edged sword, right? Of like, what do you do about the problem?
Completely. And I think thinking more around, we could talk about the various topics that inspired you, as I'm sure there are many, but is there any, if you were thinking of an inspirational figure in your life, whether that's in criminology or personally, was there anyone that stands out to you as pushing you to this particular career path or academic path?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably like a combination of like personal and professional kind of people in my life that's pushed me. I think that the professional side is really hard because I could, rattle off a sort of, not that long, but like a number of academics who've kind of, whose work I found really, really influential in getting me to where I am. But I think like, I don't know, if I'm going all the way back, and this is only something I've just started thinking about in my life, but if I'm going all the way back into like why I am here, I mean, honestly, like it's mum and dad, right? It's our parents have such a big influence on us. And I remember I've always wanted to be a teacher. Like that's something that's, one of my earliest memories is getting like a blackboard as a Christmas present one year from my parents. And that was something I just loved using as a kid, because I loved kind of role playing and imagining myself as a teacher. And so I guess as an academic, that is what you do, right? And so that's something that I've only just joined the dots on that kind of recently in the past kind of couple of months myself.
No, I will say, well, it's I definitely agree with the parent side, and my parents, although not in academic professions and being a first generation student, not really that side of it for me. I would love to say that I had as clear-cut version of potentially an early inspirational route for going into teaching as yourself. I wanted to be a fire truck when I was a child, not the firefighter, the truck. So yeah, that's definitely my earliest career memory was I think I watched a bit too much Transformers and a bit, but yeah. So thinking about your work more specifically and that inspirational side, can we just have a bit of a chat around what impact you hope to achieve, whether that's from the PhD or more generally? What is it that you're hoping to achieve from your work?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. I think impact is something that is a really loaded word in academia. I think, yeah, obviously, everybody wants to measure impact in some way now, and I think there's loads of conversation about the metrics that we use, like journal citations and things. Do those things actually matter? What is impact, right? I think for me, what does impact mean for me? We can cut this is a long pause to think, which hopefully we can cut. But like, honestly, just looking back at my, academic career, if we can call it that, right? Like, I'm obviously still in the middle of a PhD. I don't have, an academic career yet. But looking back at where I've been, the times where I felt the most impactful was like literally in a classroom teaching, right? And, kind of seeing that things that I was saying and the ideas that we were talking about were making an impact on students. And so, like, I think being an educator has always kind of been a goal of mine. And if anything, like, being able to kind of share and talk about these kinds of ideas that I'm researching is the kind of impact that I would like to have. Forget the journal citations, forget, everything else. It's the ideas and being able to share them. That's the impact. I think the other kind of area of impact that is worth talking about is actually like impact on government policy and kind of like actual outcomes, right? And this is something that I sort of think about in lots of different ways at lots of different points in time. Sometimes I feel really, really optimistic, right? Because I'm like, I've worked in the civil service. That was what my work was before I started the PhD. Like, I kind of get how the levers of government work. I think government generally has a favorable relationship with research. If they see that there's research, there are people in the public service at least who will use it. Whether or not it gets taken up by decision makers is another question. And then that's when the pessimism comes in, right? It's because like I've seen kind of some of the decision-making processes that happen right at the very top. And I'm like, these actually, like, I don't know whether these people really do care about the research. And criminology has had a particularly kind of fraught relationship with that in its history as a discipline, right? Because I think a lot of evidence has been produced by criminology research that shows that punishment is not good for rehabilitating people. The harsher we punish people and the younger we intervene in their lives, the less likely they are to kind of be rehabilitable, right? But I don't think a lot of decision makers are really heeding that advice. So it comes back full circle to kind of pessimism then again. And it's just, I have lots of conflicting thoughts about that kind of impact, but what can you do,
It's really interesting. And as someone who is very similar to yourself, I very much think education, particularly in higher education, needs to be valued more because, like you say, we don't measure that metric particularly well. And it's the fact that even hearing myself say that metric very well isn't really the point. It's the impact that you have on the individual's lives, but you have to quantify everything because that's how you get paid and how you get funded. And but I think it's also really interesting on the policy side, because one of the things that I always think, with having done some work in this area more from a sociology side, is from an education point of view, we generally recognize that if you're working with a student, that praise is generally the better way of doing it. That does not mean that you can't have boundaries. People think, oh, it's all praise, it's all treat, it's all reward. That's the only way you do it. And I don't think that's the most articulate way of viewing it, so that's how it's seen. And I think, going similar to your point, I think because politically punishment seems to be that firmer line, that better line for winning votes. That's the way that a lot of parties take. And I think it's because, unfortunately, convincing someone that a different track is the better way to follow is harder. That's my take on it. And therefore, we'll take the easy route. We'll target the fast victories, the easy wins. And that's my view of someone who's, I suppose, worked closer to politics than I would like. And I much prefer working in policy than politics. But yeah, unfortunately, that's my take on more the politics side, which sounds very similar to some of your experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, from a research point of view, we know that's a hollow victory when we punish somebody, right? Like, it feels good in the moment, but it comes back to bite us because that person ends up not actually kind of learning as much as they could from the experience, or ends up, with a horrible relationship to institutions that are meant to serve them, right? Like, if we think about, the law is meant to protect people, and education is an institution that's meant to bring people in and educate them, like, it is really harmful to that relationship that person has with the institution that's supposed to be there for them, right?
What is it then, on a positive note, what really excites you the most about what you do or your field?
Yeah, it's tricky to kind of pivot into this topic from what we were just talking about, but in terms of things that excite me, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying before about where I feel like I've had the most impact, right? Like, in a classroom, working with young people, often, well, I guess young people who are students who are coming into these ideas for the first time. At the same time as I'm kind of doing research with and about young people as well, often very different young people who aren't uni students and may or may not kind of become uni students. So, like, I think, I don't know. I still haven't, like, figured out the point that I want to make by talking about those things. I think it has to do with, this sense of feeling like I'm in touch with the next generation at the same time as I'm kind of still young-ish, but like starting to age out of being young, and starting to kind of find my feet as an adult more, but still kind of working with, people of a younger generation in a range of different ways. I think that is really exciting because you get in at this time where the way they are seeing the world and the way they are seeing themselves in their place in the world is still quite like malleable, right? I imagine this might be something you find interesting about education as well as a discipline. It's just it's a time period in life that is really, really full of opportunity, and I think that is an exciting thing.
And I think that's a lovely way of putting it. I think certainly from an education point of view, I would certainly agree, is seeing the transformation that either you can have specifically on that person's academic or professional journey or personal journey, because I've had students that have been really interested in, I used to teach a lot of land-based subjects, so there'd be students that come in, they, let's say, want to be a dog trainer. They leave the course not wanting to be a dog trainer, but they've discovered something else. And seeing that pivot is really interesting. But equally, seeing them learn some of the softer, the life skills that are just as important, or just generally being interested in a topic, like where a number of my previous students who have found me afterwards and told me a bit more about what they're doing currently, what they're studying, where they've gone from that. It's really interesting to see how they've taken some of those experiences and really defined their own path. And that's something that I will never take for granted in education and teaching specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something to be said as well about like putting yourself into that work, right? Because there's something to be said for delivering it in the way that the institution has always delivered it, but, being able to put yourself in there and the way that you think education should work and the way that you think universities should work and the way that you think, interviews with young people should work. And it's like being able to kind of just do things a little bit differently to show them that, it doesn't have to be this kind of, at its worst, a lot of these institutions aren't like fantastic, right? But showing that it doesn't have to be this way. It's not. There are adults out there that you can trust with things, and there are people who, really want to see you succeed.
Completely. And I think the other thing, I know something that I've been trying to develop, both from a research point of view and from a personal academic interest from an education point of view, is teaching not just content, but teaching context, particularly as I'm fully aware of my personal background, giving me immense privilege. So as a result, bringing in some of that context of science in general, education, how things have been taught, how things have been approached, framing that though in a way that is not necessarily neutral, because it's not a neutral subject, but framing it in a way that the individual can find that accessible. Like, this is to say, this is what the situation is, these are the barriers, these are what different people are facing. It's not to say that means this is going to be where you are now going to have to jump over a significant hurdle because of your background, but something that you need to be aware of so the doors can be open to make it more equitable for other people from other backgrounds and so on. And it's being more aware of that. And I think from both education and a lot of the subjects I've worked in, teaching purely content, which a lot of institutions prefer, doesn't necessarily do that very well, and it also doesn't make it accessible for various different individuals. And I'll completely admit, one of the reasons for doing this is I can only represent my own story, my own perspectives, and it's better for other individuals to be able to see individuals who sound, talk, study various areas like they're interested in. And that is why this was born as a bit of a tool and a thought experiment. But and that's, I suppose, where outreach and education.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's great to hear a bit more about the context of this as a project, and the way you put content versus context as well is really, really, I really like it, because especially in working with young people, it's like everybody has their own individual context that they're bringing to something, right? Not everyone is learning or approaching content in the same kind of neutral way, as you said. I'm just repeating what you're saying now because it was, pretty spot on. So absolutely kind of working with the context of what the content itself, but also like the people that you're engaging with and the context of your own life as well. Yeah, it's all really.
And well, I'm glad to see that we're speaking from basically the same hymn sheet, which is always good from an education point of view and a professional point of view. But to pivot into a slightly different style of questions now. This is telling your story in 10 words or less, and it's a bit of an opportunity for various different listeners to hear a bit more about you from a more potentially accessible and quick-fire round, and equally put you a bit on the spot where you don't have to articulate a particularly well-thought-out answer, but just very quick-fire responses. And hopefully if there's any areas you want to expand in the future, please go ahead and stitch the clip when it goes on. Okay, so start us off with then, Mark. What did you want to be when you were younger?
Yeah, I guess a teacher, right? We're giving rapid fire answers, 10 words or less. Yeah, what did I want to be when I was younger? A teacher. Easy, one word.
And how do you want people to see you?
Not so simple a question at all. I mean, I guess as a researcher, engaged, thoughtful, well-intentioned, positive impact.
And can you describe your field or body of work in 10 words or less?
If we're just looking at my work itself, I think, criminalize young people and their stories, I think is probably the most specific summary of my work. About my field more broadly, I guess, crime and the laws that create them, I will say. I used that phrase in a video I made at one point, and somebody pointed it out as a set of words that they hadn't heard or thought about before, this idea that, like, the law is what creates crime, and I was like, yeah, cool. I can work with that. That's what criminology is all about.
Yeah, and I think that the combination of the two, I think, works just under that 10 words, or just within, so yeah. So, what is the biggest challenge in your field?
This could be a one-word answer too, but I guess like conservatism. Conservatism, penal populism.
Potentially something a bit easier. What is a surprising fact about you?
I don't know if that's that easy. A surprising fact about me. Does it have to be uni-related? I mean, not that I'm thinking of one that's not uni-related, but what's a surprising fact? Oh, a surprising fact about me is I also did an economics major in my undergrad. I bury this fact like there is no tomorrow because I don't think it says anything meaningful about who I am, and I disown the idea that it did an economics major, but factually it's there on my transcript.
Part of me expected that potentially you to say something along the lines, because a lot of people I know, when you said about your field work, I expected you to say, oh, but you're a Cambridge PhD student, and that really, even though that's not a surprising fact, but it was something that a lot of your followers or people who came to the video found very interesting, because they were a bit surprised by that from what I saw.
Yeah, I think so. I think I always do find myself explaining why I am here but doing research there, or why I'm from there but come here to study it but then going back there to I honestly, explaining that is a pretty big, other than the conservatism and the penal populism, that's the biggest barrier I face.
I think although that's the end of my quickfire questions anyway, one of the things that I want to touch on, and I think this is the best time to do it because we've just basically touched on it tentatively, is so why field work back in Australia? What was the motivation to however long that project was?
I wanted to go back to Australia, I guess. I mean, all of the reasons kind of come back to knowledge of the sector / the fact that that's, where I want to settle down eventually. I think, because I've lived there, I've worked there, I kind of know what the youth justice service sector is like, and I could kind of know where the politics of it are at the moment. So a couple of years ago, we had this, really big racialized kind of, so-called African gangs kind of discourse about youth crime in Victoria specifically, and kind of seeing what happened as a result of that and what's been happening. I feel like that's the point that I wanted to kind of intervene in, and also that is, I'm invested in that work, and it's something that I want to do in the long term anyway.
I suppose, as you're saying about long term, what is it then that you want your legacy to be? What does your legacy look like?
I guess if we're going back to that idea of where I felt the most impactful is in a classroom, right? I would really want my legacy to be all the students that I've taught to remember me in some way, whether they go on to become, lawyers and they practice law, they think about, what criminology has taught them and what I have. It's very weird saying what I taught them because I'm not like the mouthpiece, but like what we discussed and what we learnt together in that classroom, right? Or if they go on, to become police or prison officers, like I can't, denounce them for choosing a career like that when you study criminology because that's what people aspire to do. But they think about the things that we talked about in that classroom and apply it to their work, find a way to apply it to their work. Or if they do something completely unrelated, but are still interested in those ideas and still come back to and think about them when they go to the ballot box to vote or when they, decide what issues to be interested in, what they teach their kids. Like those, are all kind of ways that I would want to have a legacy, I guess.
Okay, so both personally and professionally shaping the next generation.
Yeah. On
that point then, thinking more about you, what has really shaped, how have you been shaped by your heritage, whether that be academic heritage, so the people who've taught you, or the personal heritage?
Yeah, I think for me it's the academic heritage that comes to mind a lot because where I studied my undergrad at Melbourne Uni, the criminology department there was extremely critical. It was a really kind of just sort of community engaged, very kind of anti-violence and anti police and prison violence kind of department of criminologists, and that kind of did a lot for what I think of as the discipline. It moved, I guess, what I thought the discipline was completely, and now this is what I think the discipline is, which no longer aligns with what a lot of people think the discipline is, right? And I think having studied criminology for pretty much 3 years all the way in that environment, where pretty much every subject I took was very, critically oriented, has had a big impact on the kind of criminology I'm interested in.
Now, what type of advice would you give to students who are potentially going to go into fields like criminology or other subjects? What would the general advice or guidance you'd offer be?
If we're thinking broadly, I think there's something to be said for taking the time to engage with your lecturers and your tutors and whatever titles they hold, actually taking the time to engage with faculty. I think that when I have taught, it's students who've reached out to me with questions and things like that I have always felt. I don't know if this sounds egotistical, but it's when I give them feedback and they take it on, it's yeah, you did what I told you to do, so I'm going to give you better marks. But it's this idea of if you've engaged with faculty, it's kind of it's a really good way of showing your interest in the topic, right? And that you want to learn about it beyond just turning up to class. I think that's really, really important. I mean, your faculty aren't there to get you, they're there to help you, right? And, with the way universities are, we can only be so proactive about going out of our way to help you. There is an onus, I think, on students to reach out if the subject that they are studying is something that they are interested in pursuing in any kind of way.
Like you say, from my own position in education, I think most people, particularly lecturers and teachers, are very similar. They want to encourage students to reach out to them and to hopefully impart that bit of a connection with them. And hopefully they show some form of interest that you can then scaffold and support them in that particular way. And realistically, it's making their life easier and making our life easier. But of course, when there's students who are disengaged or disinterested in a subject, it's the job of the educator to try to encourage them to find that interest in the subject. That's what we're there for at the end of the day. But equally, we also have to recognise that a student might not be disengaged because they aren't interested in the subject. It could be they might not understand the methodology or the approach that we're taking, and it can be quite overwhelming for them. So it's trying to recognise and encourage how we can get the student to ask us various questions about what they're struggling with or don't understand, and how we can then convey that in a more accessible way for them at the end of the day.
Yeah, but that's what it is, right? Because I think a lot of students, especially if you've come straight into uni, you actually just don't have that much experience of the world. You don't know what's out there. And sometimes, if you are struggling to find a case study for an essay, go and ask somebody for ideas, right? Because there's no expectation that you know every single thing that happened in the world in the past, whatever, how many years, right? If you don't know if you don't know what's there and you don't know, you should ask to kind of get that information. And I think it's really important to add to this answer that this isn't all just in the service of getting better grades and doing better on assignments. It's to do with your relationship with the field that you study, your relationship with other people in the field. It's not about, getting kind of instrumental information to get a better grade, but it's about kind of that relational element of like building that relationship because, everyone there is there to support you. I think it's not about, getting grades or getting better grades than other people. It's like, universities are a community, right? And I think it's really important that everybody recognize that they have a role in contributing to that community.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it's not just because I have a strong element in my PhD that effectively says that. But one of the things that I would also really want to highlight is because I feel it's not something that we talk about enough is if you're a student out there who's thinking, I want to ask a question, but I don't know if it's the right question, just ask your lecturer, your GTA, your various support networks that are around you. And from my position as an educator, just take it as there's no wrong question. If you have something that you're trying to find out more about because you don't know the answer, you don't know the method, just ask the question. Educators' main positions are to help you experience that subject, those skills in the various ways to make it more accessible to you so you can learn. And most educators who are worth their salt will be wanting to support you in that way. And if they aren't, then they're not necessarily the best people to be teachers and educators. And therefore, if you're trying to reach out for various people to get that support, then do ask.
No, yeah, absolutely welcome questions. I genuinely think like no stupid questions is the truth that I live by. Obviously bad faith questions exist, but like, if you're asking in good faith, I don't care how, stupid the question is. If you've asked a question that you think is stupid and that, other people might perceive as misinformed, then I consider that a failure on my part as an educator to give you the context necessary to ask a better question, if anything.
Absolutely. And as educators, we aren't expecting you to know the answer. We're not expecting you to be 100% there. The whole point of us being there is to teach you. And therefore, any question that you ask is something that we're hoping to clarify for you.
Yeah, hand you your BA certificate tomorrow. Like, yeah.
But sticking with this whole learning experience and the academic journey side of the process we go through, is there a particular subject that, whether that be at school, university, college, whatever, that you have come back to later in life that you wish you stuck with more or you wish you knew more about?
I mean, this will be a very niche answer about my field again, but um, part of criminology looks at culture, cultural criminology, it's kind of called, and this is something that I wish I'd spent more time on because when I was doing my undergrad and my honors and my thesis and things like that, I was looking a lot at like corporate crime, right? Which only has tangential relevance to culture. A lot of the time, you're looking at those kind of you know corporate and government entities that are sustaining it, and less at the democratic culture that sustains those things. And so, like, I wish I'd kind of looked at culture a bit more because it's something that's like coming up in my PhD now, and I'm wishing I spent more time on it. I wish I could give a better summary of what like cultural criminology is, but it is a very broad field.
Now, very similar for myself as well. When I was doing my PhD, I used artifacts in my methodology. So I got students to draw what they were doing and effectively show their interpretation of how they were viewing their overall career and the directions they were pursuing. But for me personally, art was something that I was never particularly good at and actually got a U pre GCSE in it. So it was something that I was never going to take post GCSE, but it was something that when I saw the broader context of how it could be applied to research, science, and interpreting an individual's opinion or perspective, that really showed me the value that could be as broader than the arts and humanities more broadly.
But see, that's a good example now because that's also like, yeah, I wish I paid more attention to art as a kid too, because it's like there's a whole school of thought about like visual methods as research that I'm like, I don't really feel like I can do this because I don't know anything about art, and I would feel funny asking people to do art when I can't do art, or like I haven't, it's not something that I've really invested that much time in beyond, you know, primary, secondary education. So, yeah.
I think this is a really important point, though, in terms of how we teach the humanities, arts, literature, in particularly in schools. When we deliver them in a way that is more skills focused, and whilst that's absolutely important, it's important that we also teach the contextualized side of it. So rather than just teaching the child how to sketch, how to write creatively, how to interpret, the author's opinion, teaching them the context of it, the story behind it, more from why they're interested in that particular topic, what it tells them about why the society, why the culture in general. Because for me, I get far more from literature, from theatre, from the arts than I do from learning about the likes of mice and men and the anthology and understanding poetry purely based on the perspective of what are they trying to convey or convince. Instead, to be more focused on the context that it sits in. What were they saying at the time? How does that fit in with society? And that type of example. For me, I think if we don't teach, particularly within the arts and humanities, that important contextualization that really goes hand in hand with the social sciences, is we basically miss the point for a lot of what is that foundation that the students need to understand about those particular topics, those subjects, and what those artists and creatives are effectively thinking when they came up with that body of work and what they were trying to effectively describe as the society of the day or the human condition overall.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about artifacts too, I also think about like, a lot of our research participants have talked about like music that they make or music that they like. And it's just like a whole different world to the kind of music that I listen to. But the music that they make, sometimes it runs the gamut. They make a lot of like everything from like Christian rap to like drill rap. And those are very different things, right? Because one's talking about, Jesus and God, and one's talking about, all the kind of horrible things that you do when you go out on the streets and interact with other young people. So it's like, just kind of, yeah, if the music that we learned in school was also a bit more like, I mean, we did do a little bit of music in school, but it was never, anything that would be kind of contemporary or relevant in that way. So maybe there's something to be said there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying that the fundamental skills are not equally important to teach, but I think there's a way that we can deliver this in a more potentially accessible manner to different students. And yes, absolutely, we're inviting some criticism from potentially teachers who deliver these subjects. But I think the main thing that we should be getting at is from different than in STEM. I think the important side of accessibility in these subjects is not necessarily can everyone do it, but it's why everyone is doing it and what that importantly teaches them about their broader contextualization within STEM or other professional settings. I think that is potential opportunity that we need to try and do and need to try and deliver more for these particular subjects as prime examples, because after all, it's that how those individuals feel and how they experience those various circumstances in the lab that really informs their perspective of society as a whole, and that's the teachable moment that we should be trying to extract from their work. As we're getting to the end of this week's episode of Sitting Down with Scholars, what I want to know from you, Mark, is what is the question that you would have for the next content educator or researcher about either their work or their impact? What are your thoughts?
I think something that I've been thinking a little bit about as we've been chatting is when you're an academic, research versus teaching. Obviously, in an ideal academic job, you get to do both, but I'm interested in what other people prefer. Do they prefer research or teaching?
So one of the questions from one of my previous guests was, can you share an experience when you finally felt confident when you were able to manage imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I saw this question in the prep list and I was like, I don't know if this is going to come across as really like snobbish, but there have been times when I've read other people's, because I think like writing is something that I do well, right? There are other academic skills out there that I don't think I do so well. I don't think I like present my research super well. I haven't had heaps of practice there. And I don't think I'm like a really good like networker as such, but like writing is the one skill that I've always felt a bit more confident in. And there are days when I feel uncreative and unproductive when it comes to writing, and that's fine. They happen. But sometimes just like reading the written work that other people do, I'm like, whoa, like there are very, not obvious, but like there are gaps here that I think I wouldn't have left in my own writing, and it makes me feel a little bit better.
That's something that's really interesting to me because that's a lot of the flip effectively of what my own experience is of my PhD milestones have been, that rather than enjoying and feeling really comfortable in the written side of it, I felt far more comfortable in the speaking and discussing side of it. So the ESA, the LSR, and potentially even the prospective Viva that's coming.
No, yeah, I guess like so much like people would watch me present and I feel the same way. They're like, oh, this guy is, completely floundering when asked a question. At least that hasn't happened to me. Like I feel like that must happen in reverse. And it's also just something to think about as well when like whenever I meet with my supervisor and she's like starts poking holes in what I've just sent her the previous week to read, I'm like, let me take that on notice. I'll get back to you in 2 weeks. It's like I can't answer questions that my supervisor gives me on the spot even. So yeah, that's a real skill as well.
One of the questions from my previous guest, Mark, for you was basically how do you differentiate between the professional you and the personal you, and how does that come across in your videos, your content, and your work?
That's a really interesting question. Especially like thinking from the content point of view. I'm like, because I feel like I post mostly like professional like stuff about my uni degree, but every now and again I sneak in like a more personal video, just like a vlog or like stuff I'm cooking, stuff I'm wearing, stuff I'm doing. I think I don't like. I would always like push back on the premise of the question a little bit and be like, I think that kind of divide is a little bit blurred for me. Yeah, I think they meet my professional and social kind of sides. I guess meet in a lot of ways. Like I try to be myself when I turn up in a professional context. Like if I'm interviewing a young person, I'll dress like myself, talk like myself. I'll present kind of as naturally as I can. If I'm going to work, I'll sort of like when I say work, I mean like if I'm going into my department, I'll do the same, right? Like I dress quite casually, and the way I interact with people is very similar. Like it's I think it's fine to blur those lines, not to the point of like being, unprofessional, in the workplace and stuff. But I think it's okay and it's good to bring a bit of ourselves everywhere. Even just thinking about like interviewing as a methodology, like you want to kind of be yourself. You want to come across as genuine. Because that's important for the conduct of the interview. So just thinking about that on a bigger scale, I think, yeah, I don't know. I think that's a boundary I actively try to break down.
It's interesting there, this boundary, whether it's more of an implication for the informal sciences, the likes of the humanities, social science, education, criminology, where because of how ingrained it is to the human condition and who we are as individuals, that maybe we come across differently in terms of how we go about embedding ourselves and our work together, and it might be more different. And as a result, there might be a separation for those who are working in more the formal sciences, the likes of STEM, engineering, and so on.
Yeah, maybe, right? Like I think especially in like the sort of social sciences, it's like stuff will happen in the world outside of your business hours that will make you think about your work again. Or you'll read like a news article and like things will happen that sort of just draw you back to your work. Whereas I think maybe in like some of the more sort of harder sciences or firmer sciences, like there's a like firmer split between when you're doing your work and when you're not doing your work. Like if you don't have, a pipette in front of you, you're not going to be able to do your thing, right? You can think about it, but like you're not going to actually be able to do it. Whereas like sometimes like things will happen in the world at like 10 p.m. I'll read a headline and I'll be like, shit, that's really interesting. Let me go and write something about it. Or let me make a note of it. Things like that. So maybe, yeah, I don't know.
I think, like you say, this whole eureka moment about where you see something, hear something, or have read something that really informs your day, your thoughts, and your perspective, and how that in itself has ramifications for not only our professional but also our personal lives.
Yeah, no, that would be really interesting. Because yeah, that kind of like sort of late night surge of inspiration does happen. I'm like, I better get all of this out of my head before I go to sleep. But like, if you need equipment to perform experiments, for example, it's like you kind of can't just be doing that whenever, right?
No, I think absolutely that. I think for STEM fields particularly, I think if they're trying to produce content based on what they've worked on, it's likely either a snapshot into their day, which they've recorded at the time, or they're reflecting on after the fact, or they're talking about the topic that has inspired them throughout that day and therefore inform them. But outside of that, and as we're getting towards the end of this episode, Mark, what is the areas that different people can find you on social media if they want to find out more about your story, your work, and what you generally do?
It'll be TikTok. MLY2365, I think is my handle. Yeah, I'm very, very lax with other. Don't have Twitter, don't have Blue Sky.
Well, there you have it, folks. If you want to find out more about Mark's academic journey or his story generally, then please check out his social media. And again, from my guests and from myself, Mark, thank you very much for joining us on Sitting Down with Scholars. And please do tune in again in the future where I'll be speaking to another scholar about their content education or their field of research and study. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you again, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.